Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
What I learned in that moment when I was thinking about hitting the water and that whole golf moment is that the mind is a powerful thing. I feel a little bit giddy about this series that we're launching today called Remodel Your Mind. And in this series over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about some very practical things on how you and I can start to kind of renovate what's going on up here. Because if we can change our mind, it does have an impact on the direction of our lives. Paul was a follower of Jesus, and he's spoken to this so much. Look at this. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. This is 2,000 years ago. And here's what we know today. Science tells us 80% of your thoughts are negative. It's almost like Paul tapped into this, and he's like, I know all that science stuff. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person. How can I actually do that? Well, Paul says, I'll tell you how. By changing the way you think.
So, Buck, this past week we kicked off a series about thoughts, and I have been on the other side of you for a long time.
Sure.
10 years, and all your thoughts and all your things, and we've developed this terminology we talk about, the ism terminology.
Sure.
It's a Northpoint ism that we say something like that, but isms are like our own personal kind of quirks and things that we do that are kind of unique to us.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll be like, oh, that's a Buck-ism, or sometimes you'd say, oh, that's a Jeremy-ism, and like, yeah, that's just who we are, and that's, I'm curious, the reason I start that way, what are some of your isms as it relates to your thought life?
Oh.
If you can share them on this podcast.
Well, see, sometimes, yeah, exactly. Sometimes isms are like in the moment. It's an ism. It's like the moment is, and boom, here's what I said, and I'm like, that just came out of me, and then you're like, that's a Buck-ism.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think some things like, the whole thing with seafood, like I don't understand that. And so when I talk about, seafood and where did that originate? Was that like the first person who was on their last little step, and they were, so hungry, and it was like, I'm starving and all I need is one last food, and they saw a fish and they were like, maybe I should eat that. And then they did it for survival means. And then somehow they were like, ooh, tasty. And, maybe that's that's, I just don't understand. And when it comes to seafood, like, even when it's good, like, you taste it. Like one time Jill and I, when I was working at Dell, I won a trip to Puerto Rico, and Jill said, here's some lobster, try it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, again, I'm just, there's some definite mental issues on my side when it comes to seafood. And so I tried it, and I was like,
You liked it?
But then all of a sudden I went, it's seafood. And I was like, I spit it out in a napkin. I was like, this is terrible. And it was a weird kind of conundrum, because on one hand I was like, it's good. But on the other hand, there was so many thoughts that were competing with that actually being good. And so it's definitely, and the more I talk about seafood, I think people go, oh, that's a Buck-ism.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, that's just strange. And I would say you're right. It is strange.
Yep. That's a good one.
You don't like seafood?
No.
No seafood.
Completely out. No, I did.
What if you go to Britain and it's like fish and chips?
They have bread there, I think. I think they have bread and they have beer. And so, like, then I'm good. Those two things, I'm like, hey, that's fantastic.
I will say when I was 10, I did Taekwondo. It was a big part of my life early on. Yeah. And I did a tournament in South Korea. And my parents couldn't afford for them to go, but they could afford for me to go with some friends who were going. And so they sent me when I was 10 across the Pacific to South Korea to go compete in this tournament. Well, I had like the appetite of a 10-year-old. I ate rolls for like 8 days straight because it was all squid, and it was all sorts of seafood. And so I just had roll after roll after roll. I mean, they just had like loads of bread. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, if you stick with the essentials,
Yeah,
bread.
the essentials, America. Yeah, carbs.
I'm telling you, man. Yeah, there's lots of seafood that you look at and you're like, just visually speaking, it should be like, ding, 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 I should not eat that. And,
Yeah.
but some people look at it and go, yummy.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah. My
Jill-
parents are like that.
Yeah, Jill's that way too.
Yeah,
Anyways, I don't know. There's a lot of things like, some, and we've talked about this before, but I think one of the cool things, and it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, when you feel like really good about you, not like artificially or something, but you just feel really secure and you feel safe around the people, like you've created a culture you feel safe, you are much more free to speak. And when you're free to speak, then the isms come out. And I think this is kudos to you.
Oh, yeah.
I feel so safe around you, Jeremy.
Oh.
And so that's why all the isms comes out,
That is
because
so sweet.
you're just such a great guy.
yeah, yeah. Or you've just been on the other side of me long enough that you're like, I can't hide these things anymore. This is just who I am.
That could be true too.
Yeah. Well, we kicked off a new series, Remodeling Your Mind, and part 1. And man, some just fascinating stuff kind of in the science lane, about thoughts and our minds. And then even more so fascinating, looking back 2,000 years to what is written in the New Testament and what Jesus talked about, what Paul writes, and even back to the Old Testament as well. And it's wild when you begin to read the New Testament. I mean, Jordan was telling us this morning, as he's prepping for a later part in this series, he was like, man, I'm all of a sudden I'm reading the New Testament these past couple of days differently. I'm seeing mind and thoughts and just all sorts of different kind of brain isms pop up all over the New Testament.
Sure.
And you realize how intertwined our spiritual life is with our thought life. And I think that was a big, takeaway from part 1, and I think we'll keep taking that away. One of the things you talked about is the whole idea of retiring thoughts that are not good thoughts, that are negative thoughts. I want to start off by asking, where do these thoughts that are not good originate from? Why do we have these thoughts in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I would say 2 things. One, what you said earlier. So if you're watching or listening, I would just say, man, one of the coolest things about reading the Bible is discovering what we're talking about on Sunday and what science is talking about. It's just there's such a kind of confluence. They're kind of come together, and it's affirming. So what science is discovering with neuroplasticity, what I talked about on Sunday, I had a conversation with somebody who's part of a doctor's office who works on with individuals who've gone through traumatic and all kinds of stuff. And they were so appreciative for part 1. And they were like, man, I'm so grateful that you're actually bringing in science and what scripture say. And so I only say that to go, man, read the Bible. It's so cool to find over and over and over, like places it talks about your mind and your thoughts and your eyes and your heart. All of that's talking about your brain and the fact that you can begin to rewire your brain. You can begin to change your brain. And I just think that's just a cool thing. So if you're listening or watching, hey, go like on this fact-finding quest in the Bible and just how many times it talks about the mind. Yeah. And then to your question, I think there are 2 things that hit my mind. I think, past experiences are part of that. And I think there's a spiritual component that's the other part of that. So I think a lot of our past experiences, like here's the thought that I think you should retire, it came from your mom. It came from your dad. It came from that coach. It came from that bully. It came from that insecurity because of the group of people who made fun of you as a result of whatever stature, whatever, characteristic. And, or maybe that first job, second job, or that team you were part of, something there has got locked inside of your head, and it's from the past, and it's now determining what you think of you, what you think of people, what you think of men, what you think of women, what you think of the world, and that's a lot of where our thoughts come from. And I would almost say, gosh, just camp there. Like, go back to childhood, go back to what happened, go back to that traumatic experience, go back to the thing you don't want to think about, because I bet a lot of our thoughts have originated there. And I'm speaking to more negative, not the positive side of things. And I also think there's there's a spiritual piece of this. When you ask that question, I thought of James, the letter of James, and it talks about why do we sin? And where do these, things come from? Like, we do the things I don't want to do, and it's hurtful to me and hurtful to the people around me. Where's that come from? And James says, God isn't tempting you to sin. That's not where that voice in your brain is coming from. That's from internal, and that's a spiritual piece. And when I say spiritual, I think it's really important to know that, for me personally, I believe that Jesus is real and Satan is real. And I believe Satan is real because Jesus said he's real. And Jesus said he's a deceiver, he's an accuser, he's a liar, and he's a murderer. So when you think of our thought life, all the accusations about you and the people around you, all the lies perhaps that you believe that are negative about you and the people around you and the world around you. And if deception is, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that he masquerades, and he's speaking of Satan, masquerades and tries to outwit our thinking. So he's trying to outwit your brain to get you to think about something that simply is not true. So I think that's where some of those negative thoughts from a spiritual perspective will come, because I believe in a real Jesus and a real Satan. And I think he's trying to get our minds. I think that's the competition is for our minds. And then I also think your past experiences inform a whole lot of those desires and temptations and appetites and so many things that we feel and think in our adult lives.
Yeah. That's quite a bit to jump into on question number one there.
Welcome. Here we go, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting. It makes sense as to why, I don't think anybody is born, grows up, and goes, I just naturally think about really, really good things all the time. Mm-hmm. We tend to lean the other direction, and it kind of is a evidence to, kind of that, I guess, that force at work,
Yeah. Well, like I shared on Sunday, I mean, it's crazy to think about this, that a person has 6,200 thoughts a day. 8 out of 10 of those thoughts, 80%, are negative. And 95% you're borrowing from the day before. You're just rethinking what you already thought. And if those are negative, and then you're compounding that with the negative thoughts of today, I mean, it's just a lot of negativity. Yeah. So certainly there are, I think, people out there that, man, they've really done some work, or environmentally they were taught young or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They have they're able to capture their thoughts well.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I mean, general public, starting with me, I mean, gosh, we think a lot of negative things. And again, I think so much of those are systemic to childhood and systemic to kind of the tension we feel spiritually in this world.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of leads us into our next question, okay, we have all those negative thoughts. Well, I think that there's a negative thought that comes to mind when I think about my negative thoughts, and that is that how do you navigate finding a thought that you truly need to retire, but yet also not just naively focusing on the kind of put your head in the sand and just wishful thinking, kind of how do you not end up doing that? Because that's as people jump to the other opposite end of the spectrum, and they're like, well, I'm not happy. But I'm trying to think, and this is such a spiritual, emotional, mental discussion that we're talking about. It blends all three of these things. So how do you not naively just go, well, I'm just going to think positively then?
Yeah, I think if I hear the question right,
and you might not be, because I over talk the question sometimes.
I think it was good. I think if you go with me for a second, there's kind of this American Idol syndrome, if you will, in our thought life. And what I mean by that is, in American Idol, I have a thought, and I do personally have this thought, and I have this thought.
Yeah, you've told me.
I am a heck of a singer. When I get up and I sing, whoop, see, did you hear that tone in there? I mean, there was some tone and good stuff in there. So I believe that's my thought.
For all those listening, this is a Buck-ism that you're experiencing
right
here
this second. See,
yeah.
I can't, and I just feel so safe with you.
Yeah.
So, there's this thought that in my head, oh man, I'm really good. The reality is I need to hear from somebody who loves me enough, somebody perhaps like you, that Buck, I appreciate the fact that you think that, and I think that's good. You should be motivated and maybe work on that skill or craft. But the truth is, that's not good.
Yeah.
And so you need to be the Simon Cowell in my life. And you need to be able to say, hey, I love that. I'm curious about you, Buck. And if that's one of the things that kind of makes you, say giddy up and you want to try to sing, great. And you think you're a great singer, great. Can we have that conversation? And can I be the Simon Cowell in your life?
Yeah.
And so I think part of how we discern this is you need some Simon Cowells in your life. You need some, and this is where we talk about connection, community. It's so incredibly important. And more specifically, I think if you have somebody in your life who loves Jesus and can take your thoughts and be able to compare those to what Jesus has to say about what your thoughts are. So that would be a spiritual maturity aspect. I think that's a really good thing. But I also think, the Proverbs 27, and I've shared this before, talk about wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. Mm-hmm. There's somebody in your life to go, hey, bro, or hey, Chiquita. I don't know what, I'm not, but whatever that is, it's like, listen, can we have that conversation? Can I reflect something that may be hard for you to hear? You're not a good singer, And so, God has given you other skills, but He hasn't given you all skills. So go pursue those other skills. Yeah. And, that's even a fine line. You hear some, these very dramatized stories of somebody who was told you're not a good, skier, and they end up being an Olympic skier, something like that.
Right.
So you've got to be careful with that. But I would say, if I'm thinking about that, you've got to have the community, the connection, the Simon Cowells in your life. And this is where I say a lot of times on stage, I'll say, man, with what we're talking about today, I want to encourage you to go to a small group leader, a pastor, a counselor, whatever, somebody who's willing to tell you the truth, but to leverage both grace, where they meet you in that moment relationally. You've built enough trust, but you've built enough trust that you can hear no.
Yeah.
That you can hear that's not good.
Yeah.
And, you got to, my counselor always told me, Buck, you got to trust somebody in your life. I would like to be that person that, you're willing to trust. So, but you got to pick who you're going to trust. So Simon Cowell, I thought I'd try to bring him into this podcast.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you told me yesterday, we had a meeting, and I was about to walk out, and we were just talking and about life, and you said, hey, just take those things captive. Make sure to bring those to the Lord, like whatever you're feeling or thinking. And that that was exactly what you just said. Is like, you have that community, those people who ask you those or tell you those kind of things, like, hey, I see you wrestling with this. Make sure to take those things captive, Yep. Also, it makes me think of a book by John Acuff. I love John Acuff. He's a really just funny guy, funny writer.
Very funny.
Yeah. And he's one of the only writers I've read his books and I laugh out loud as I'm reading, which is kind of awkward because you're sitting in a coffee shop with a book and you're like, and people are looking at you a little strangely.
Yeah, see, you're just real secure.
Yeah, I guess so. But he has a book called Soundtracks where he kind of takes this whole thought life concept and basically says we all have a soundtrack to our life. We all have this soundtrack of thoughts playing, whatever songs are on our soundtracks. Those are the things that we allow to give airtime in our brain and our mind. And he says that, this isn't like a spiritual book. This is more just based on the science behind it all. But he says, taking these thoughts captive per se is, he puts it through this grid. And I think this grid is really helpful. Mm-hmm. And he has these 3 questions to ask so instead of just going, oh, that's a negative thought. Well, I'm just going to think the opposite, but I don't feel it. And so now I'm discouraged again. Mm-hmm. Instead of doing that, you take these thoughts. You're like, okay, that one's really doing some damage in my life. Mm-hmm. And you ask these 3 questions. Is it true? So is that a true thought? Is that a true thought? So, if I'm sitting there thinking, oh, about to walk out on stage or something, oh, I'm such a loser. Well, is it true? Well, no, I haven't lost anything. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's not true. Is it helpful? Well, it's like you were saying, don't hit the ball into the water. Mm-hmm. That was not a helpful thought because it made you do the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. And so is it true? Is it helpful? And then is it kind? Mm-hmm. And this one was interesting for me. I was kind of like, okay, why is it kind? But I can see how kind would kind of steer you in the direction of the positive thought. Mm-hmm. In Philippians, when Paul talks about, hey, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, think about such things. Almost whatever is kind, think about those things and don't listen to the non-true and or the false and not helpful, pieces. So,
yeah, and it feels like that's got a lot of energy around your thoughts about yourself. Mm-hmm. I think anytime you're thinking, I'm ugly, I'm not significant, I'm not enough, I don't matter, there is no hope. I think I've thought a lot of those thoughts, and if you're watching or listening, I would imagine, perhaps you have as well. And that's a great grid to go, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? Or when somebody hurts you, I'll never forgive them. I'll never forgive them. I get that emotionally. So I'm not saying don't think that, but it is a good grid to go, is it true you'll never forgive them? Well, in the moment it feels that way, but maybe it's not true. Mm-hmm. Is it helpful? No, because it's going to lock me up. I'm not going to be a free man or free woman if I hold on to this. And is it really kind? No, it's not kind to me at all. It's actually going to imprison you for not forgiving them. So I like that grid. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Great way to capture our thoughts.
Yeah. And I was thinking about too, the is it true question feels so significant. And this is where you can really bring it from just a like scientific secular lane to a really spiritual lane. Because when you look at what Jesus said, I mean, how many times he started what he was going to say with truly I tell you, or I tell you the truth, right? And he's going, hey, here is some factual things for you to take and kind of digest and consume in your thought life. You know what I mean? And I was reading this morning, it's when he's talking to Pilate and he says, if those who love me will know the truth. And it's like, okay, if you look to Jesus, you keep your eyes fixed on him, well, what does he say about you? Well, you feel like a loser. Well, Jesus says you're made in the image of God. And Jesus says, he died for you because you have value and worth. And those are the true thoughts that you want to hold on to.
100%. Yeah. I think that's a great grid. I like it.
Yeah. So, let's see, I'm going on to my next question. Some of our unhelpful thoughts are conscious. Others are not. Sometimes things are just kind of going, like we have so many thoughts a day, we can't really digest and try to analyze all of our thoughts. But sometimes there's a like deeper unhealth going on. What are some tools we can use to actually become aware or identify those thoughts that we need to retire, to kind of pull those things to the surface?
Yeah. Again, I talk about counseling all the time, but I think sometimes you need somebody beyond you to get beyond you.
Yeah.
So if you have somebody who's beyond you, which means it's not you, it will take you to a place a lot of times that are far beyond what you could get there on your own. And so I think sometimes that can be in a book. All of a sudden you're reading in a book and you're like, man, that I had no idea. Their story released something in me that I really wasn't, conscious of, in terms of I don't think about that every day, but now I do.
Yeah.
Because of a book illuminated that. I think of, a friend of mine was telling me about something that was unlocked, a conscious thought that was unlocked. And she shared a story, and I think I've shared this on Sunday, but when, she in her 20s and her 30s, and when I was talking to her, she was 60 at this time. She'd never been married. She'd always really struggled with trusting men. And it wasn't necessarily a conscious thought she had until she was like 33, 34. And what she discovered at 33 and 34 is that she definitely didn't trust men at that time, and it was strong, but she didn't know where that came from. So it wasn't like this, man, I'm fully aware of this thought. And through counseling, somebody beyond her began to ask her questions and begin to even go back to childhood, which I alluded to in question number 1. So much of our unlocking our future is connected to our past. And so we got to go back there. So she goes back. And what's amazing is our brain has the ability to black things out. In other words, it's like it turns off in some very traumatic moments, which means you don't remember, but your brain does. And it informs your thoughts. It informs your thinking. It informs your dispositions. It informs your desires and appetites. But you don't know where that comes from, because whatever created that you have the ability to kind of numb that pain to the extent that it's black. So you don't remember. You're just like, I've always been this way. I've always thought this way. I've always felt this. It's legitimate. You have, because of what your brain is possible or capable of. And so through counseling, somebody beyond her began to unlock the fact that when she was a 6-year-old girl, her dad, would do things that no father should ever do, that are as evil as you can imagine. And she recalled a memory that she was 6 years old in the bathroom, pounding on the table or the countertop, yelling, I will never trust a man. I will never trust a man. I will never trust a man. And that was a thought that she was completely not conscious of until she was 34 years old. And it required somebody beyond her to get far beyond what she was capable of on her own and bring that to the surface and begin to go, that's not a healthy thought.
Yeah.
That's a thought I need to retire. That is not a thought of God. I know where it comes from. I identify it, and it's not right, so I'm going to do something with it. And so I think counselors are fantastic. That's one of the reasons. I think books are fantastic. I think blogs are fantastic. I think small groups and all that kind of stuff, just relationships can bring those unconscious thoughts to the surface. And now you're more alive. Now you're more aware than you've ever been, and that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost, I've heard you say before, you have to go back in order to go forward.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think, being on the other side of people for a lot of years now, one of the things I've noticed is people really, really excited. They start to follow Jesus. They start to experience growth, and they serve, and they get in a group, and they're growing. And it's really awesome to watch people take these next steps in their faith. But so often I'm sitting on the other side of somebody who has not gone back, and they find their faith staggering at some point. And, this comes from a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzaro.
I don't know how to say his last name.
I don't know how to say his last name either.
Yes,
Scazzaro, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he just argues that, a lot of people who start to follow Jesus, Christians, never go back. And it ultimately just like bottlenecks their faith eventually, because in order to move to the next place where they retire those broken thoughts and they replace those lies with truth, they have to go back and let go of those old broken soundtracks. And that's how you continue to grow in your relationship with God. It's such a spiritual thing.
Yeah, I think Jesus is the Savior of you today, and Jesus is the Savior of your past as well.
Yeah.
But you got to go to your past to allow him to redeem, to restore, to reconcile, to speak truth, to speak healing into so many things that happened when you were 4, 12, 18, 25, etc. And so, oftentimes when the gospel comes, it's like, man, I realize my sin has separated me from God. I realize that. Oh my gosh, for the first time, I'm opened my eyes. And that there's nothing I can do. But here Jesus steps in because he loves me and he's for me and he has done it for me. And my part is to believe and put my confidence and trust in him. I am saved from my sin.
Yeah.
That's so cool today. But it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
It's like, and he wants to go to what happened with your mom and dad. He wants to go to what happened in that first dating relationship. He wants to go to what happened with that uncle or that bad church experience. And he wants to redeem all of that in your life. And so I think that, again, that's why it's so important to go back and continue to invite Jesus. That's why on Sunday I said, man, fix your eyes on Jesus, because he is the author and the perfecter, and he will redeem and restore the pieces of your story. I've seen it too many times, and I've experienced it personally.
Yeah, that's great. One other tool I want to add into it, and this is just a personal one that I've really enjoyed in terms of retiring broken thoughts. Solomon says a man's heart are like deep waters. One with insight draws him out. So one with insight looks into the deep waters and is able to kind of clear through and see what's actually going on down there. And that's kind of what our thought life is like too. For me personally, I'm such a thinker, not a feeler. So I can think a lot. But
I affirm that for anybody listening. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. You'll ask me, how do I feel about something? And I'm like, I'll tell you in 3 days because I won't be able to tell you until then.
Sure.
But, one of the things for me is just journaling down, what am I thinking? Okay, I can see it. It like forces you to cognitively, tangibly put it on paper, which means you have to force those thoughts into words. And when you put it on paper, all of a sudden you see it and you go, I can much more easily recognize that's not true or that's not helpful than when it was just kind of floating around in my head over and over again. And so for me, one of the tools of retiring broken soundtracks or thoughts is just put it on paper.
Yeah.
Putting it on paper helps so much.
100%. You got to identify it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So last question, because it can be kind of a vague concept, what does retiring a thought look like practically? I just shared kind of one example that could be, but is it a conscious decision? Is it a written statement? Is it a prayer? I mean, that could be a whole lot of things. I've heard you say, you quote this a lot, take every thought captive. What does it mean to take every thought captive? What the heck does that look like actually?
Yeah, well, just so I give credit where credit is due. That's Paul, the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
He's like, take every thought captive. So that is not an original statement
Buck,
from
this
me.
is amazing. Oh my gosh,
just quoting the Bible.
Yeah.
I think you hit it. I mean, you said a lot of things. Practically speaking, to retire thoughts. One of the things is you've got to identify it. Is it a problem or not? Is it a good thought or bad thought? Is it a thought that you need to retire? Or is it not? And I think what we've said so far throughout the podcast and what John Acuff said, and having a counselor, help you identify. My counselor would always ask me the question like, whose voice is that? Whose voice is that? So it's like the idea to go, even that question makes me think about the fact that, is that a good thought or bad thought? One of the thoughts I used to have is like, strength is showing no emotion. Strength is showing no emotion. The second you show emotion, you're a weak man. That was a thought. And I believed it. And I would do everything Like, don't feel. And I should be feeling in this moment. It's an emotional moment, celebratory moment. It's a hurtful moment. I should feel, but I'm like, men don't feel. And so one was just identifying, and my counselor, and I've shared this before, said, well, Buck, then I don't think you like Jesus. And I was like, really? Yeah, because Jesus walks into the temple and starts flipping tables. Oh, he's feeling and emotions all over. Oh, his friend Lazarus is dead, and now he's weeping to the point where in the Greek, it's like this idea to go, emotion is flying from Jesus. He is most alive. He's alive to hurt. He's alive to laugh. He's alive to feel. Buck, you're not alive. You're not fully alive. And I was like, oh my gosh. So identified that thought. That's one I need to retire. And then I think, how do you begin to retire that thought? I think, what I said on Sunday as well is what's so interesting, science says the neural pathway you can sow deep. So I sowed that thought for years and decades. And that was a deep neural pathway in my mind. In other words, I knew it would take time. I had to give myself patience. So the idea to go 30, 60, 90, 100, 120 days, yeah, it could take months to retire these thoughts. So I think that going in with your eyes wide open, retiring your thought, you got to identify it. You have to give yourself some patience. You're going to wrestle with it. You're going to trip over it. You've sowed routines and habits. And, hey, when I experience this, and part of my coping mechanism is I go back to that thought. Well, that's not a good thought. And then, eventually you got to replace it. So, retiring a thought could be, being aware, and then it's kind of like you got to run over that old thought with a new thought. Mm-hmm. So you run over it enough times. It's like, road work, that big, I don't know what it's called, the big thing with the big wheels that's really heavy.
A car, a tractor.
Roller. When they're laying new road, it's
yeah.
like the thing that's smooth. They go back and forth, and I'm like, just one time's enough. That's a heavy thing.
It's good we're not in construction.
Exactly. What kind of roads would we build? But the guy goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And that's sometimes retiring a thought. You just go back and forth enough to with the thought that you're replacing it with to now that thought is smoothed out. Mm-hmm. That thought is no longer present.
It's covered over.
Yeah, it's covered over. I think, practically speaking, put it on your phone, put it on a mirror, share it with a friend and have your friend remind you over and over and over of that thought, bring some accountability in some sense, put reminders and pop-ups on your devices because they're so cool to do that. Mm-hmm. I think replacing a thought or retiring a thought is reading the scriptures every day. I think you're renewing your mind every single morning because your mind has a disposition to go back to that old thought that's not helpful, but you need to retire it. So how do you retire it? Every single morning, wake up and allow the scriptures to renew your thoughts.
Yeah.
Go follow Jesus and allow him to renew your thoughts. So, for me, again, all that to say, you have to identify that's a thought to retire. That is not a good thought. It is not true. It's not healthy. For me, again, I've shared this before. I'm not, I used to think I'm such a loser. I'm no good. I don't matter. I'll never be enough. People don't like me. And that was just, all those thoughts are just simply not true.
Yeah.
And I had to replace that with Psalm 139, that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. So I retired it by every day for 30 days reading Psalm 139. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And that's like that big machine going back and forth and back and forth. And it kind of sows out, retires this thought, and starts to press in a new thought.
Yeah.
And so that's how I've personally experienced it, but I'm sure there's a lot of other great ways.
Sure. Well, that's a great way to wrap up the podcast. Mm-hmm. We're going to keep talking about, retire, replacing, and repeating, and these new thoughts and replacing our broken ones and what all that looks like. And I'm really excited for part 2 of remodeling your mind and where we're going to be going. So, Buck, thank you so much.
You got it.
And we'll see everybody Sunday.
Yeah. Thanks, man.